Jessica pulled into the small town, the wheels of her beat-up car crunching over gravel as she parked outside her modest rental. She took a deep breath, hoping the air would clear away the nerves. This town was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place to rebuild after the turmoil of her last assignment overseas. She hadn't expected to feel so anxious, but then again, years in the military had taught her never to let her guard down. As she got out of her car, Jessica was aware of eyes on her. A couple across the street paused in their conversation to stare, and a man sitting on his porch leaned forward, curiosity sparking in his gaze. Jessica met his eyes briefly before looking away, reminding herself that she had every right to be here. After all, she'd fought for her country, given years of her life to protect its citizens. Surely she could settle in a quiet town to find some peace. But the tension in the air felt almost tangible. Just as she opened her trunk to grab her bags, she heard a low rumble. She turned to see a group of motorcyclists cruising slowly down the road, their leather jackets and sunglasses gleaming under the sun. As they passed by, one of them made prolonged eye contact, his expression shifting from curiosity to something darker. Jessica felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "Welcome to your new home," she murmured to herself, attempting to shake off the unease. A middle-aged woman with graying hair walked up to her with a wary smile. "You must be the new tenant." Jessica nodded, extending her hand. "Jessica Turner. Thanks for renting the place to me." The woman shook her hand briefly, glancing over her shoulder as the motorcycles revved up before disappearing around a corner. "I hope you'll like it here, Jessica. It's quiet." Her tone held an edge, something unsaid lingering in her eyes. Jessica gave her a polite smile, trying to stay positive. "That's exactly what I need." The woman nodded slowly, but there was doubt in her eyes. Jessica could sense it, that silent question lingering just below the surface. "What are you doing here?" After unpacking, Jessica decided to take a stroll to the local grocery store. The fresh air helped calm her, and she told herself that this was just a small town, and people would get used to her eventually. But as she made her way down the street, she felt the stares again. People didn't just glance at her. They studied her, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. When she reached the store, a young cashier gave her a half-hearted smile. Jessica smiled back, hoping to break the ice. "Hi, I'm new here," she said, placing a few items on the counter. "Just moved in." The cashier glanced up, her expression uncertain. "Oh, yeah, I heard about that. Small town, you know. News travels fast." Jessica nodded. "I'm a former service member, just looking to settle somewhere peaceful." The cashier's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, quickly scanning the items. Jessica could feel the curiosity mixed with something else, a wariness that seemed to ripple through the town like a silent wave. As Jessica walked back to her new home, she caught sight of a few familiar figures lounging outside a bar. The bikers from earlier. They watched her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She told herself it was nothing, just a small-town quirk. But as she met their gazes, something within her stirred, a feeling that this town was hiding layers she hadn't expected. She clenched her jaw and continued walking, straightening her shoulders. She was here to rebuild her life, and she'd been through tougher challenges. Whatever lay ahead, Jessica Turner wasn't one to back down. Jessica thought she'd found peace, but this town may hold more than meets the eye. What happens next will shock you. Don't miss out. Jessica awoke the next morning to the faint sound of rustling outside. She tensed, her military instincts kicking in, then reminded herself that this was a peaceful town. But old habits die hard. She grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, scanning the surroundings. Nothing seemed amiss, just a few birds fluttering away, startled by her presence. As she walked down the path toward town, she spotted a man standing by the edge of her yard, as if he'd been waiting for her. He wore an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his clothes were worn and dusty. He looked up as she approached, eyes sharp but hesitant. "Jessica Turner, right?" he asked. She nodded cautiously. "That's me. Can I help you?" The man glanced around, as though checking if anyone was watching, then took a step closer. "My name's Tom. Used to live here all my life. Just thought I'd warn you." His voice lowered. "Not everyone here's thrilled about new faces, if you catch my drift. Jessica felt a twinge of annoyance, but kept her tone polite. I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just looking to start over. Tom nodded, his expression softening slightly. Yeah, well, just keep an eye out. Folks around here, they're set in their ways. Might take a while before they warm up. He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving Jessica with a strange sense of foreboding. She shook it off and continued her journey into town, her resolve hardening. This was her home now, and she wouldn't let anyone intimidate her. As she passed a small diner, she caught the scent of coffee and decided to step in. The place was quaint, with checkered tablecloths and faded photos of the town hanging on the walls. A few patrons glanced up as she entered, then quickly looked away. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that everyone here already knew her story, or thought they did. She took a seat at the counter, and a waitress with a kind smile approached her. Coffee? Please, Jessica replied, grateful for a friendly face. As the waitress poured her a steaming cup, she introduced herself. Name's Linda. You must be the new gal folks are talking about. Jessica chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. Seems like I'm the town's hot topic. Linda smiled sympathetically. Small towns, you know? People here don't like change much, but give it time. They'll get used to you. She leaned in closer, her tone dropping. Just mind the bikers. They're a rough bunch, not too keen on strangers. Jessica sipped her coffee, remembering the intense stares from the previous day. Thanks for the heads up. I can handle myself, though. Linda nodded approvingly. I'm sure you can. Just watch your back. The warning hung in the air as Jessica finished her coffee, her mind already buzzing with questions. This town had secrets, layers she hadn't anticipated. But she wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Just as she was getting ready to leave, the door jingled, and two men walked in, both wearing leather jackets with patches on the back. Members of the same biker group she'd seen yesterday. One of them noticed her and nudged the other, whispering something under his breath. Jessica met their gaze, refusing to look away, her expression unreadable. One of the men smirked and walked over to her. You're the new girl, huh? We don't get many visitors here, especially you know? Jessica raised an eyebrow, her tone steady. Is that a problem? The man shrugged, leaning closer than necessary. Depends. We like to keep things local. Jessica held his gaze, unflinching. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just living my life. The man chuckled, his smirk widening. We'll see about that. With a final, lingering look, he turned and walked back to his friend. Jessica watched them go, her pulse steady but her mind racing. This wasn't just small-town suspicion. This was something darker, something that felt like a test. She knew she'd have to tread carefully, but if they thought they could scare her off, they had another thing coming. As she stepped outside, the bright sunlight did little to ease the tension that had settled over her. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was only the beginning, and she could already feel that the challenges ahead would require every ounce of resilience she had. Jessica's new life is off to a tense start, but will she stand her ground or be forced out? Don't miss the next chapter in this thrilling journey. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. Jessica made her way back to her small cabin, the strange encounter at the diner still swirling in her mind. She'd expected some resistance. After all, starting over in a town this tight-knit couldn't be easy. But the animosity she felt from those bikers was something different. They weren't just skeptical, they were threatening. As she turned the corner of her street, a movement caught her eye. A figure, half hidden behind a rusted truck parked at the edge of the yard, watched her approach. She slowed her pace, instinctively reaching for the small pistol she kept in her jacket. The figure stepped out, revealing a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, wearing a faded hoodie and torn jeans. She looked nervous, but her eyes were sharp, searching Jessica's face for something. "You're the new girl, huh?" she asked, her voice quiet but direct. Jessica stopped a few feet away, not making any sudden moves. "That's right. Who's asking?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Name's Ellie. You don't know me, but you should know something about this town." She paused, eyes darting around as if ensuring no one was listening. "Things aren't always as they seem. People here, They don't like change. They don't like you, either. Jessica tilted her head slightly, the tension in the air palpable. Is that supposed to scare me? Ellie shook her head quickly, as though she was unsure herself. It's not that. There's something off about this place. People are afraid of what happens when someone like you shows up. They're afraid you'll shake things up, and they don't want that. A chill ran down Jessica's spine. And why should I care what they're afraid of? Ellie took a step closer, lowering her voice even more. Because they'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way. They'll make your life hell if they have to. But there's a way out. If you want it. Jessica's hand instinctively clenched into a fist, but she held her composure. What are you talking about? Ellie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder again. There's a lot of dirty secrets around here. Things that people don't want anyone to find out. But if you're smart, you'll stay out of it. Just leave before it gets too late. Jessica studied her, noticing the fear in Ellie's eyes. The same kind of fear she'd seen in people who knew too much. Ellie wasn't just another small-town local. She was involved in something deeper, something bigger. I'm not leaving, Jessica said finally, her voice firm. I didn't come here to run from anything. Ellie's gaze softened for a moment, like she was almost relieved. I thought you'd say that. She looked past Jessica, her face tightening. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Before Jessica could respond, Ellie turned and vanished into the shadows between two houses, leaving her with a gnawing sense of unease. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jessica didn't know whether to feel more disturbed by Ellie's cryptic warning or by the way the town seemed to close in around her with every passing hour. The bikers, the whispers in the diner, and now Ellie's warning. It was all connected. But how? And what could she possibly do to expose whatever darkness was lurking just beneath the surface? Her mind was still racing when she finally made it back to her cabin. She was about to step inside when she froze, her senses on high alert. Someone was standing in the shadows at the edge of her porch. A voice broke the silence. You're not the only one who's been watching, you know. Jessica turned, a hand instinctively brushing her sidearm, but the figure in front of her was already stepping out of the dark. It was Tom, the man from earlier. He looked different now, more serious, and the faint trace of a warning gleamed in his eyes. You need to listen to me, Jessica, he said quietly. Things are worse than you realize. And I'm not just talking about the bikers. Jessica's breath hitched, her thoughts racing. What do you know? Tom looked around once more, then stepped closer, his voice barely audible. I know who you really are. I know why you're here. The words hung in the air between them. Jessica's pulse quickened. What does that mean? He didn't answer right away, but his gaze was intense, locked on hers like he was trying to gauge how much he could trust her. I've been through some things that don't make sense. Not in a town like this. But I know people who can help you. If you want out. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Out? What was he offering her? An escape from this place. Or something darker. I don't want out, she replied firmly, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. I want answers. Tom nodded, as if he'd expected her response. I thought you might. But be careful who you trust here. Not everyone is who they seem. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Jessica standing there with more questions than ever. The night air was thick with tension as Jessica stood on her porch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Tom's cryptic words echoed in her mind, but they didn't bring clarity, only more questions. Who were these people he was talking about? And why was he so sure she was here for something more than just a fresh start? She didn't have answers, and for the first time since arriving in town, she felt a rising panic. But as she turned toward her cabin, the weight of it all crashing down on her, a figure appeared in the distance. A tall, broad-shouldered man was walking down the road toward her, moving with purpose, yet with a quiet, deliberate grace. She could tell immediately it wasn't someone she recognized. Instinctively, Jessica's hand went to her sidearm, but she didn't draw it. She wasn't sure why, but something told her not to make a move just yet. The man slowed as he approached, stopping just a few feet away, standing still in the shadows. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left her. You're still here, he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. Jessica raised an eyebrow, studying him. "I'm still here." The man exhaled, shaking his head slightly as though he was disappointed. "You're making a mistake." Her grip tightened around the doorframe, her stance still defensive but resolute. "I don't take advice from strangers." He seemed to consider this for a moment before his lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Stranger? That's funny. I think you'll find we're not so different after all." Jessica's heart pounded as the man stepped closer, his presence more intimidating up close. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer right away, but instead glanced at the darkened sky as if measuring the passing of time. "You're here for a reason," he said finally, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "I don't know what it is yet, but I know it's not good. It's never good." "Why are you warning me?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "What's your stake in this?" The man studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment before answering. "Because I've seen what happens to people who don't listen. People who don't get out while they still can." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, weathered notebook and handing it to her. Jessica hesitated, taking it in her hands. It was old, its edges worn, and the pages inside had the faint smell of smoke. "Look through it," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "But don't show it to anyone. Not yet." Before she could ask another question, he turned and walked away, his footsteps disappearing into the night as if he'd never been there at all. Jessica stood frozen for several moments, staring at the notebook in her hands. Her mind raced. Was this another warning? Or was there something in that book that could help her understand what was happening in this town? She didn't have time to waste. After a deep breath, she stepped inside her cabin and locked the door behind her. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside casting long shadows across the floor. Sitting at the small wooden table, she flipped open the notebook. The handwriting inside was hurried, frantic, like the author was trying to get everything down before they ran out of time. The first page was filled with a list of names, some crossed out, others circled in red ink. Her finger traced the names, each one striking a chord deep within her. One stood out, Tom Hale. Her breath caught in her throat. Tom? Why was his name here? And why was it circled? The next page was more cryptic. Lines of disjointed sentences, fragments that seemed to spill out like someone who had tried to write down their thoughts but couldn't quite make sense of them. Words like betrayal, blood, and dead appeared frequently. It made her stomach churn. She turned the page. A single sentence sprawled across the paper in bold letters. "They watch everything. They know everything." Jessica's skin prickled with unease. They? Who was they? The next few pages were filled with drawings, distorted sketches of people with blank faces, all seemingly staring straight ahead, and small symbols she didn't recognize. Then, at the very back of the notebook, there was a map. It was crudely drawn, with only a few notable locations marked with an ominous red X. One of them was her cabin. The other was the diner. The last one sent a chill through her. The woods. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the locations. Why had someone marked her cabin? What was so important about the diner? And what happened in the woods? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the night air, jolting her from her thoughts. It came from the woods. Without thinking, Jessica grabbed the notebook, stuffed it into her jacket, and rushed out the door. Her pulse raced as she made her way toward the sound, heart thumping in her ears. The woods loomed in the distance, dark and dense. She could barely make out shapes in the trees, but there was something, someone, moving through the shadows. She couldn't ignore it. She had to know what was going on. As Jessica stepped into the woods, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't just walking into the forest. She was walking straight into the heart of the mystery that had begun to unravel around her. And there was no turning back. Her heart clenched at his words. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just walk into those woods and unlock whatever nightmare awaited her. But the map in her hand seemed to call her, drawing her toward the unknown, toward the place where everything would change. Jessica stood up, her legs shaky but determined. The time for questioning was over. She didn't have answers. Hell, she didn't even know what she was looking for. But she had to go. For better or worse, she had to face whatever was out there. The man's cold, calculating gaze followed her as she made her way to the door. "You won't find what you're looking for in the town," he said, his voice almost a taunt. "The answers are in the woods. That's where it all began. And that's where it will end." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The woods. They had always been a mystery, filled with old stories, rumors of disappearances, strange happenings that the locals whispered about but never dared to investigate. She had written about it once, in passing, as part of a larger story, but nothing could have prepared her for this. "Stay close," Tom said, his voice suddenly full of urgency. "We'll follow the path you take, but you can't do this alone. You can't trust them." Jessica looked back at him, her heart aching at the distance she now felt between them. This wasn't the man she had known. The Tom she had trusted was slipping away, and all she could do was cling to the hope that somewhere inside him, there was still a way out. With one final look at the man who had been orchestrating this entire nightmare, Jessica stepped out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, biting into her skin as she made her way toward the edge of town. The moon hung high above, casting pale shadows over the streets. The town felt quieter than usual, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she walked, her mind raced. What was she about to uncover? What kind of power lay hidden in the woods, waiting for her? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she couldn't turn back now. The map had led her this far, and there was no denying its call. The road quickly turned into a dirt path, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in around her with every step. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods felt alive, watching, waiting. Jessica's hand tightened around the map as she moved deeper into the forest. Each rustling leaf, each snap of a twig underfoot, seemed to echo in the silence. It was as though the very forest itself was breathing, drawing her closer to whatever lay hidden within its depths. Minutes, or was it hours, passed as she walked, the path winding and twisting in ways that felt increasingly unnatural. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy of leaves above, casting the woods in an eerie half-darkness. But the map was clear. She followed it as best as she could, knowing that each step took her closer to the unknown, to the truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Then, she saw it. In the distance, through the trees, there was a clearing. A faint light glowed from the center, a pulsing, almost unnatural glow that seemed to beckon her forward. Her pulse quickened. This was it. She was standing at the edge of whatever dark force had been waiting for her. The key, the door, it was all here. Jessica stepped forward, her legs trembling as she moved into the clearing. The light grew brighter with each step, until it illuminated the entire area, revealing an ancient stone structure in the center. It was shaped like a doorway, but there was no door, just an empty frame, like the remnants of something long forgotten. The air around it crackled with energy, an electric hum that made her skin prickle. Jessica's breath hitched as she stepped closer to the structure. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became. It was as if something inside her, some buried instinct, recognized the place. The door was not just a physical thing. It was a doorway to something much bigger, and Jessica was the one who was meant to open it. Her fingers trembled as she reached out toward the glowing frame. But before she could touch it, a voice echoed through the clearing. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was sharp, commanding, and Jessica froze, her heart racing in her chest. Slowly, she turned to find herself face to face with someone, or something, she hadn't expected. Tom stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes dark, his face twisted in an expression of warning. "You have to turn back," he said, his voice trembling now. "You don't know what you're unleashing." But Jessica didn't listen. She couldn't. Her hand closed around the frame of the doorway, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Jessica is standing at the threshold of something unimaginable. But is she ready to face the consequences of unlocking the unknown? What happens next will change everything, and you won't want to miss it. Keep reading to uncover the truth, and don't forget to share your thoughts. The moment Jessica's hand made contact with the glowing stone frame, a surge of power shot through her, like electricity coursing through her veins. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, everything around her seemed to melt away. The woods, the clearing, even the sky. It all vanished into a swirling vortex of light, sound, and chaos. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the sensation stopped. She blinked, struggling to catch her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse hammering in her ears. She felt as though she had crossed a boundary, one that no human was ever meant to cross. The world around her had changed. The clearing was still there, but it felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like a dense fog had settled in. The trees, once silent, seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost spongy, and the light that emanated from the stone doorway was no longer a welcoming glow. It was a piercing, blinding brilliance, like staring directly at the sun. Jessica staggered backward, her hand still trembling from where it had touched the frame. The map that had guided her here was now nowhere to be found, as if it had vanished along with everything else she had known. And then there was Tom. His figure was now just a silhouette in the distance, his face unreadable, his body stiff as he stood frozen at the edge of the clearing. The desperation in his eyes had turned into something darker, more menacing, and his hands were clenched at his sides, as if fighting some invisible force. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and strained. The words were barely more than a growl. "You don't understand what you've unleashed." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice trembling with the weight of fear and confusion. "What did I just open?" Tom took a step forward, but it wasn't the same man who had stood by her side just hours ago. There was something twisted about his presence now. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was being controlled by something far beyond his own will. "I warned you," he said, his voice cracking. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than both of us, bigger than anyone." Jessica took a step back, her eyes darting around the clearing as if seeking some kind of answer. The energy in the air was palpable, charged with a force she could almost feel in her bones. The stone doorway, still glowing bright, now pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. Tom's eyes flashed with a deep, dark anger. "You should never have come here, Jessica. You think you're the key? You're not. You're a pawn in something far older, far more dangerous than you can comprehend." Her mind raced. A pawn? She had to make sense of this, of everything that had been happening. The map, the strange man, Tom's cryptic warnings. It was all connected. But how? "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice gaining strength despite the terror clawing at her chest. "What is this place?" But Tom didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to the stone doorway, and for the first time since she'd entered the clearing, she saw fear in his eyes. "It's too late," he whispered. "The door is open now. It can't be closed. And now it's looking for you." Before Jessica could process his words, the ground beneath her feet shifted, a low rumble reverberating through the earth. The trees creaked and groaned as if something enormous was moving beneath them. She could hear it now, a low, guttural growl, rising from the depths of the forest. The air itself seemed to thicken with the scent of something decayed, something ancient. The stone doorway flickered, the light growing sharper, more intense, until it felt like a searing flame. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her chest, rattling her very bones. And then it came. Out of the shadows, from beyond the doorway, something emerged. Something that defied description. It was dark, shifting, like a living shadow, its form too large, too distorted, for any human mind to fully grasp. It was as though the darkness itself had taken shape, stretching and writhing, reaching out toward her with an unholy hunger. What happens next will change everything, and you won't want to miss it. Keep reading to uncover the truth, and don't forget to share your thoughts. The moment Jessica's hand made contact with the glowing stone frame, a surge of power shot through her, like electricity coursing through her veins. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, everything around her seemed to melt away. The woods, the clearing, even the sky. It all vanished into a swirling vortex of light, sound, and chaos. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the sensation stopped. She blinked, struggling to catch her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse hammering in her ears. She felt as though she had crossed a boundary, one that no human was ever meant to cross. The world around her had changed. The clearing was still there, but it felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like a dense fog had settled in. The trees, once silent, seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost spongy, and the light that emanated from the stone doorway was no longer a welcoming glow. It was a piercing, blinding brilliance, like staring directly at the sun. Jessica staggered backward, her hand still trembling from where it had touched the frame. The map that had guided her here was now nowhere to be found, as if it had vanished along with everything else she had known. And then there was Tom. His figure was now just a silhouette in the distance, his face unreadable, his body stiff as he stood frozen at the edge of the clearing. The desperation in his eyes had turned into something darker, more menacing, and his hands were clenched at his sides, as if fighting some invisible force. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and strained. The words were barely more than a growl. "You don't understand what you've unleashed." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice trembling with the weight of fear and confusion. "What did I just open?" Tom took a step forward, but it wasn't the same man who had stood by her side just hours ago. There was something twisted about his presence now. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was being controlled by something far beyond his own will. "I warned you," he said, his voice cracking. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than both of us, bigger than anyone." Jessica took a step back, her eyes darting around the clearing as if seeking some kind of answer. The energy in the air was palpable, charged with a force she could almost feel in her bones. The stone doorway, still glowing bright, now pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. Tom's eyes flashed with a deep, dark anger. "You should never have come here, Jessica. You think you're the key? You're not. You're a pawn in something far older, far more dangerous than you can comprehend." Her mind raced. A pawn? She had to make sense of this, of everything that had been happening. The map, the strange man, Tom's cryptic warnings. It was all connected. But how? "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice gaining strength despite the terror clawing at her chest. "What is this place?" But Tom didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to the stone doorway, and for the first time since she'd entered the clearing, she saw fear in his eyes. "It's too late," he whispered. "The door is open now. It can't be closed. And now it's looking for you." Before Jessica could process his words, the ground beneath her feet shifted, a low rumble reverberating through the earth. The trees creaked and groaned as if something enormous was moving beneath them. She could hear it now, a low, guttural growl, rising from the depths of the forest. The air itself seemed to thicken with the scent of something decayed, something ancient. The stone doorway flickered, the light growing sharper, more intense, until it felt like a searing flame. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her chest, rattling her very bones. And then it came. Out of the shadows, from beyond the doorway, something emerged. Something that defied description. It was dark, shifting, like a living shadow, its form too large, too distorted, for any human mind to fully grasp. It was as though the darkness itself had taken shape, stretching and writhing, reaching out toward her with an unholy hunger. Jessica couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her body refusing to obey her commands as the shadow crept closer, its presence overwhelming every inch of the clearing. Tom's voice broke through the haze of terror. "You opened it. Now it wants you. It needs you." The words hit Jessica like a slap, snapping her out of her trance. She forced herself to take a step back, but her feet were like lead, unwilling to move fast enough. The shadow was so close now, its tendrils swirling in the air, its presence suffocating. "You're its chosen one," Tom continued, his voice almost pleading now. "There's no escape. You can't fight it. It's already inside you." Her mind screamed, "No, no, this can't be real. This can't be happening." But it was happening, and the shadow was getting closer. With a surge of panic, Jessica turned and bolted, her legs finally responding to the fear coursing through her. She ran, the forest around her blurring into a whirlwind of shadows and light, her breath ragged in her chest. She didn't look back. The growl behind her grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was chasing her was closing in. The ground shook beneath her feet, the trees swaying, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to grab her. But there was no escape. The shadow was following her, and no matter how fast she ran, it was always one step behind. Jessica's flight through the woods takes a terrifying turn, but what is the shadow pursuing her? Can she escape, or has she unleashed something that can never be contained? The truth is out there, and it's coming for her. Stay tuned for the next chapter, and let us know what you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to find out what happens next. The dense forest blurred around Jessica as she ran, each step pushing her further into the unknown. Her heart hammered in her chest, drowning out everything but the sickening sound of her own breath and the ominous growl that echoed from behind. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every rustling leaf seemed to whisper her name. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching her, closing in on her. She didn't dare look back. To do so would be to acknowledge the darkness pursuing her, and she wouldn't, let it catch her. But the sound was getting louder. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with each tremor, each rumble like a warning, a promise of what was coming. Her mind was a storm of confusion. What was it? She couldn't even form a clear thought as the terror surged through her veins. She had heard of creatures from myths and nightmares, but this was something worse, something real. And then, as if the forest itself was part of the creature's design, the ground suddenly gave way beneath her. Jessica screamed as she fell, her body plunging downward, the world spinning as she tumbled into darkness. There was no time to react, no time to brace herself as the earth swallowed her whole. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her lungs. Pain exploded through her body, but she couldn't focus on it. She had to move. She had to keep moving. Coughing, Jessica pushed herself to her hands and knees, her fingers digging into the rough earth. The air was thick down here, colder, heavier, like the air in a tomb. She couldn't see a thing, and the sound of her own panicked breathing felt suffocating in the oppressive silence. But then, she heard it. The growl. Closer now. So close she could feel the rumble in her chest. The creature, whatever it was near, and it was closing in on her. Its presence was overwhelming, like a shadow stretching over everything, suffocating every ounce of light, leaving nothing but fear and darkness in its wake. Jessica's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. She looked around desperately, her eyes straining to adjust to the pitch-black surroundings. But there was nothing, just darkness. The kind of darkness that wasn't natural, that pressed in on her from all sides. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She whirled around, her breath caught in her throat, but it was just her shadow, her distorted figure reflected in the slick surface of the stone walls surrounding her. The fall had led her to some sort of underground cavern, but she didn't have time to explore. The growl was louder now, unmistakable, closer than it had ever been. No, no, no. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape. A tunnel, a crack, anything. But there was nothing. The cavern stretched endlessly in every direction, its walls smooth and cold. The stone was ancient, worn and smooth as if carved by hands far older than anything she could comprehend. And then, in the flickering silence, she heard something else. A whisper. You cannot run. It will find you. The voice was low, ethereal, barely audible, like a breath of wind through the cracks of the earth. But it was there. It was real. Jessica's blood ran cold as she turned to face the source of the whisper. But there was nothing. No one. Just the vast, oppressive emptiness surrounding her. And then the ground shifted again. This time, it was unmistakable. The cavern trembled beneath her feet, the sound of it rising like a distant thunderstorm. The stone walls began to crack, the fissures spreading outward from the center, as if something ancient was awakening deep beneath the earth. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen. The growl, the creature, was so close now, its presence so overwhelming that Jessica could feel it in her bones. Every inch of her body was taut with fear, and yet she couldn't escape it. There was nowhere to go. A deafening roar split the air. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was a roar of something monstrous, something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The force of it rattled her teeth, shook her very core. The ground cracked open beneath her, and Jessica's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the cavern seemed to collapse in on itself. In the chaos, a figure appeared before her. Tom. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror, his body contorted as if caught between worlds. His form flickered like a shadow, but his voice, when it came, was loud and clear. Jessica! But it wasn't him. Not entirely. The voice was wrong, hollow, like an echo of the man she had known, but somehow warped. His eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, and the air around him crackled with an unseen energy. What happened to you?" she gasped, unable to tear her eyes away from him. Her heart pounded in her chest as the darkness around them deepened. "The doorway, it changes you," he whispered, his voice barely recognizable now. "It takes you. It possesses you. There's no way out, Jessica. Once it has you, it doesn't let go." Jessica's pulse quickened as she realized the horrible truth. The shadow wasn't just after her. It was after them all, and it was using Tom, or what was left of him, to lure her into its grip. The ground shook again, harder this time, as cracks spread through the cavern floor. It was coming. It was coming. Without thinking, Jessica turned and ran again. But this time the darkness was everywhere, closing in around her with a terrifying speed. Her breath was ragged, her vision blurred, but there was no escape. No safety. Not anymore. The darkness is closing in on Jessica, and Tom's twisted transformation reveals the terrifying power of the doorway. Can she survive long enough to escape, or is it already too late? The truth is unraveling, and Jessica's world is crumbling around her. Find out what happens next, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter. Jessica's legs burned. Her muscles screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. The growl, deeper now, vibrating in her chest, spurred her forward, urging her to keep moving. Her feet barely touched the ground as she scrambled over rocks, her hands scraping against the jagged stone, desperate for any foothold, any escape. The cavern was alive with noise now. The walls groaned, shifting as if the very earth beneath her feet was breathing, shifting in response to something far older and far more dangerous than she could understand. The ground quaked beneath her, sending tremors that shook her to the core. It was coming. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had taken Tom, whatever had twisted his soul, was hunting her now. She stumbled, her foot catching on something hidden in the dark, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in her side, but she didn't have the time to process it. She pushed herself back up, forcing her body to obey, her heart hammering in her chest. Every part of her screamed for her to stop, to rest, but the terror drove her forward. The roar echoed again, closer this time, as if the creature had grown bolder, its presence taking shape in the darkness. "Run, Jessica, run." Her mind screamed the order, but her body was too tired to obey. She was slipping, her vision narrowing, her breathing becoming shallow. She was losing herself to the fear, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. The cavern twisted around her, the walls closing in, the air thickening. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement, a shape in the distance, barely visible in the dim light that seemed to grow weaker by the second. She could barely make out the form, but it was unmistakable. The shadow that had been chasing her was now a hulking mass, the silhouette of a beast unlike anything she had ever seen. It was massive, towering over her, its body composed of shifting, liquid shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe as if alive. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were glowing, burning with an unnatural intensity that pierced through the darkness like twin suns. Jessica froze. The growl, no, the roar, rumbled again, so loud she could feel it deep in her bones. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but her feet refused to obey. She was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of this thing that was not of this world. She had no idea what it was, what it wanted, but she knew it was far beyond anything human. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she locked eyes with the creature, each second stretching longer than the last. In that moment, the world felt empty. The cavern was no longer just a space. It was a tomb, a prison, a place where nothing could escape. The creature took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, like liquid shadow. With each movement, the ground beneath Jessica's feet trembled, and the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body was frozen, locked in place by the terror radiating from the creature before her. And then, without warning, a voice echoed through the cavern. A voice that didn't belong to the creature, but to something far older, far more ancient. You cannot escape. It was not a growl. It was a whisper, a deep, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the cavern seemed to respond to the voice, the air thickening, vibrating with a strange energy. She couldn't understand what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. The voice was speaking to her. She took a shaky step back, her mind racing for a plan, any plan, but all she could hear was the whisper, the promise of the thing in front of her, the thing that had been hunting her since she'd fallen into this cursed place. And then she remembered something. Tom's warning. The doorway, it changes you. The doorway, the fissure she had fallen through. It had to be more than just a hole. It was a portal, a passage to something else, something ancient. And whatever this creature was, it had been waiting for her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her mind raced as the pieces clicked together. The growling, the whispers, the shadows. It was all connected. The doorway was not just a way out. It was the key. The creature didn't just want her. It wanted what she carried inside her. The darkness had followed her here, just as it had followed Tom. Jessica glanced around desperately, looking for any escape. She couldn't face this thing. Not like this. She needed to get to the doorway, to reach the place where this nightmare had started. But she wasn't sure how. She wasn't sure if it was even still there. But she had to try. With a final glance at the creature, she forced her legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground seemed to fight her, but she kept moving, her breath shallow, her eyes never leaving the dark silhouette of the creature behind her. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. Every ounce of her focus was on the goal ahead. The doorway. She had to reach it. What lies beyond the doorway? Can Jessica escape the creature that hunts her? Or has she already crossed the point of no return? The answers are coming, but will they save her or doom her forever? You won't believe what happens next. Drop your theories in the comments, like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter. You won't want to miss it. The ground trembled beneath Jessica's feet as she pushed herself forward, her body moving on pure instinct. The cavern's walls loomed over her like silent sentinels, their dark surfaces slick and unyielding. Each step she took felt like wading through a nightmare, every inch closer to the creature behind her a test of her resolve. The doorway was still a distant memory, a flicker of hope in the face of overwhelming terror. Her mind raced through every memory of her descent into this hellish labyrinth. What had she seen? Where had she been? The fractures, the strange carvings, the unsettling sense that something had always been watching her. It all felt like a long-forgotten dream, but the fear in her chest, the pounding of her heart, was all too real. The roar behind her was deafening now, a constant, low rumble that vibrated through her entire body. She dared not look back, but she could feel it, a presence, drawing closer, its hunger palpable. The creature was relentless, closing in with every heartbeat. No time to think, only time to move. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest as she scrambled over rocks and broken debris. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her lungs burning from the exertion, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Not until she reached the doorway. Her fingers brushed against the cold, jagged stone, desperate for any support, any sign that she wasn't just running deeper into the heart of the cavern. But all she saw was darkness, thick, suffocating, impenetrable darkness. The glow from the creature's eyes had long since vanished, and the further she moved, the more the light around her seemed to fade. And then, she saw it. A faint outline, something familiar, something real. The flickering light of the doorway. It was barely visible, but it was there, and it was her only chance. Without hesitation, Jessica pushed herself toward it, the sight of the rift in the stone filling her with a strange combination of dread and hope. She didn't know what she would find on the other side, but staying here was not an option. She was already far too deep, far too close to the heart of whatever evil had been awakened in this place. The whispers had grown louder, too loud to ignore, and the creature behind her was no longer just a shadow. It was an unstoppable force, bearing down on her with a wrath she couldn't comprehend. She reached the doorway, no, the portal. The opening in the stone was small, no more than a crack, but it pulsed with a strange, eerie light. There was something ancient about it, something older than the world itself. It hummed with an energy that felt alive, alive in the most unnatural way possible. And then she heard it again. The whisper, "You are mine." The voice echoed through the cavern, chilling her to the bone. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her breath hitched, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to. The doorway was all she had left. She didn't know if it was a portal to another world, another dimension, or if it was some kind of trap. But in that moment, Jessica made a choice. She reached forward, her trembling hands brushing against the cold stone of the doorway. Her fingertips burned as they made contact, a sharp pain shooting through her arm. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, a raw, jagged pain that split her mind in two. The world around her seemed to spin, the darkness swirling with a sickening speed. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she pushed harder, her body resisting, but her will refusing to let go. And then, the world shattered. The crack in the stone expanded, the light from the doorway swallowing the cavern whole. Jessica's entire body was pulled toward it, the force of the energy like a magnet, yanking her into the unknown. As she was sucked into the rift, she caught a glimpse of something terrible, something ancient, that she would never forget. The creature was close now, its eyes burning with a hunger that could not be quenched. And as Jessica was torn from the physical world, she heard the last thing she would ever hear from the creature. "You cannot escape me." And then, darkness. Is Jessica truly trapped, or is this the beginning of something even more terrifying? What lies beyond the rift? Is this the end of her journey, or the beginning of a new nightmare? Leave your thoughts in the comments, like, share, and subscribe for the next chilling chapter. The truth is closer than you think. Darkness. It was all she knew. There was no light, no air, only an overwhelming pressure that surrounded Jessica like the walls of a tomb. Her mind was clouded with fragments of fear, uncertainty, and an insatiable pull towards something distant, something calling her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her body felt weightless, yet the pressure around her felt suffocating. The last thing she remembered was falling, being dragged into that rip in the stone. But now she was somewhere else. There was no sense of time here, no sense of space. It was as if she was caught between two worlds, neither real nor imaginary. The temperature was impossible to gauge. Was she hot? Cold? She couldn't tell. All she knew was the sensation of being alive, still alive, and the nagging pull of something that hadn't yet finished with her. And then, a voice. A whisper. "You're not alone." It echoed in her mind, sending a jolt of panic through her chest. She tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat before it could form. "You belong to us now." The words came not from the air, not from any direction, just from within her own mind. As if the world around her had become part of her consciousness, every thought, every sound, every movement felt like it was part of the same dark force. It was suffocating, terrifying, and the worst part? Jessica wasn't sure whether she was still in control of herself. Panic surged within her, and with it, a burst of energy, just enough to push against the heavy weight that surrounded her. She fought for movement, for thought. Her hand moved, a twitch at first, then more deliberately, reaching outward, toward something. Anything. Her fingertips grazed a cold surface, smooth, metallic, like a door. The feel of it sent a shiver down her spine, but it was a lifeline, a way forward. With a force born of desperation, Jessica pushed against the surface, her body trembling, as if the very act of movement took every ounce of energy she had left. Then, with a creak and a groan, the door opened. The world around her shifted. Suddenly, light broke through the darkness, a stark, harsh light that burned her eyes. She stumbled forward, blinking, trying to adjust. And when her vision cleared, what she saw made her blood run cold. She was no longer in the cavern. She was standing on the edge of a vast, alien landscape. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, the soil blackened and scorched, as if it had been through a fire that never fully died. Jagged spires of rock rose in the distance, reaching toward a sky that was not blue, but an unsettling shade of red, as though the sun had been replaced by something much older and much more malevolent. The air was thick, dense with the scent of sulfur and something else she couldn't place, something putrid. The sky pulsed with an unnatural glow, as though the very atmosphere itself was alive, breathing in sync with her own rapid pulse. And in the distance, she saw it. A figure. At first, it appeared to be a shadow, indistinct and shifting, as if it was a part of the landscape itself, born from the red sky. But as Jessica's eyes focused, the figure grew clearer, and the dread that gripped her chest tightened into a vice. It was humanoid, but far from human. Its form was skeletal, stretched, as though its bones were too long for its frame. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a sickly, translucent gray, stretched tightly over its frame, and where its eyes should have been, there was nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to stare right into her soul, and it was staring directly at her. The silence between them was suffocating. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. This place, the landscape, the air, the sky, it felt wrong, like a dream that had turned nightmarish, a place that shouldn't exist. And yet, here she was. The figure began to move toward her, its steps slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. The closer it came, the more the ground trembled, and Jessica could feel the pressure in her chest mounting, like something was about to crush her. But then, the whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. "It is not yet your time." The voice was clearer now, and Jessica understood it. She wasn't meant to be here, not yet. But that didn't mean she was safe. The figure was almost upon her, and the darkness within its eyes seemed to pull her in, to draw her toward whatever fate it had waiting for her. But Jessica wasn't going to wait around to find out. With a final surge of will, she turned and ran. Her legs moved faster than they had any right to, propelling her across the barren landscape. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. The sound of the figure's footsteps grew louder behind her, a slow, steady rhythm that sent terror into every fiber of her being. What is this place? She had no answers, only the pounding of her heart and the unrelenting fear that she was running from something far worse than just a creature. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she pushed her body, the ground seemed to stretch endlessly before her. There was no escape. The figure was still there, pursuing her, and with every step, it seemed to grow closer, its presence more overwhelming. Finally, she reached something that felt like it could be the end. A massive stone wall, its surface covered in runes, glowing faintly in the red light of the sky. This had to be the way out, or at least the next step. She slammed her hands against it, desperately searching for any way through. But the runes pulsed with an ominous light, and the wall didn't give. The figure was almost there. In a final act of desperation, Jessica slammed her fist into the wall. And that's when the world around her shattered once again. What happens next? Will Jessica escape this hellish landscape, or is she trapped in an endless nightmare? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Your thoughts might change the course of this journey. The wall shattered in an instant, as if the stone had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. Jagged fragments of rock exploded outward in all directions, and Jessica was thrown backward by the force of the blast. Her body collided with the ground. Her breath knocked from her lungs as she gasped for air, heart racing with adrenaline. For a moment, everything was silent, still, as if the very universe was holding its breath. And then, a blinding light flooded the area, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The rift in the stone had opened a doorway, but what lay beyond it wasn't immediately clear. The light was so intense that Jessica had to shield her eyes, the brightness almost unbearable. With her pulse hammering in her chest, Jessica slowly forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling from both the exertion and the fear that still gripped her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and as she looked up, she saw a shape moving in the glowing light. It was human-shaped, tall, and imposing. But unlike the creature that had been pursuing her, this figure seemed different, more familiar, yet still otherworldly in a way that made Jessica hesitate. She had no choice but to step forward. There was no running now. The figure was coming toward her. As it drew closer, the light began to dim, revealing the full shape of the figure. A tall, broad-shouldered man, clad in flowing robes that shimmered with a strange, metallic sheen. His features were hard to make out, as his face was obscured by a hood, but the aura around him was powerful, undeniable. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, his voice low and resonant, echoing around her like a distant drumbeat. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Was he speaking to her? Or was there something else at work here? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hoarse and uncertain. The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, he raised a hand, palm open toward the rift, and the light surrounding them seemed to flicker. The air shifted, humming with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on Jessica's neck stand on end. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, but this time, it was different. This was not the tremor of something pursuing her. It was something far more profound, like the land itself was reacting to the figure's presence. "I am the keeper," the man said finally, his voice calm, as though he were explaining something simple to a child. "And this place, this realm, is not yours to traverse." Jessica stared at him, the words sinking into her mind. Keeper? Realm? What was he talking about? Was this some kind of guardian, watching over this twisted dimension she had stumbled into? Or was he something more? "You don't belong here," the keeper repeated, stepping closer, his gaze locked on hers, though his face remained hidden. "This is not a world for your kind." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. For a moment, she wasn't sure if the words were a warning or a threat. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with confusion. "I didn't come here by choice. I don't even know how I got here." The keeper's head tilted slightly, as though considering her words. Then, in one swift motion, he raised his hand again, and a surge of energy shot from his fingers, hitting the ground with a deafening crack. The earth split open, revealing a deep chasm, its edges glowing with a sickly green light. From within the abyss came a sound like the groan of a dying beast, a low, rumbling growl that made Jessica's chest tighten in fear. "You have been drawn here, Jessica," the keeper said, his voice colder now, "by something far older than you can understand." Jessica took a step back, her eyes locked on the chasm. There was something in there, something she couldn't see, but could feel. It was waiting, watching. "Who are you?" she asked, her throat dry. "And what is that thing?" The keeper did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the rift and placed his hand against its glowing surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the light intensified, casting everything in a blinding glow. But as quickly as it came, the light faded, revealing a vision. No, a memory. Jessica was no longer standing in the desolate land. She was somewhere else, somewhere familiar. She stood in the middle of a street, the sun shining overhead, people walking by, unaware of her presence. But everything was wrong. The buildings were different, older, more worn, and the people moved with a mechanical precision, as if they were not entirely alive. In the distance, she saw a group of children playing in the park, but their faces were blank, their eyes empty. There was something deeply unsettling about them. Then, Jessica saw something that made her blood run cold. In the center of the park stood a figure, a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes watching her. The same figure that had been pursuing her. And the moment it saw her, it smiled. The vision shattered in an instant, and Jessica was once again standing before the keeper, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The keeper looked at her, his gaze unyielding, as though he were weighing her very soul. "The rift," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "The force that brought you here. It is not just a tear in the fabric of reality. It is a link, a gateway, a path that connects worlds, and it will not let you go so easily." Jessica's heart sank as the words sank in. The rift was more than just a mistake. It was a force, something purposeful, something deliberate. And whatever it was far older and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She tried to steady her breath, her mind racing with questions, but one thing was clear. The keeper knew something that could be the key to her survival. "How do I stop it?" she demanded, her voice firm, desperate. The keeper's gaze softened, though not by much. "You cannot stop it, Jessica. Not on your own." Jessica swallowed hard. "Then how do I get out of here?" The keeper took a step back, his hand lowering. "There is a way," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it will come at a price." A price. The words echoed in Jessica's mind, sending a chill through her that no amount of heat could shake. What price is Jessica willing to pay to escape this nightmare? Will she be able to find her way out, or is she doomed to be trapped forever? Stay with us to uncover the terrifying truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your thoughts matter. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. Jessica's pulse raced as she looked at the keeper, her mind swirling with the implications of his cryptic statement. A price. What did that mean? What could she possibly give up to escape this nightmare? The keeper didn't wait for her to respond. He stepped backward, toward the shimmering rift behind him, his robes rustling like a whisper in the wind. "You cannot remain here, Jessica. But the path forward is not one you can walk lightly. The rift demands balance." Jessica's brow furrowed in confusion. "Balance?" she repeated, her voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What does that even mean?" For a moment, the keeper didn't answer. Instead, his gaze seemed to wander, as though he was looking at something only he could see, something far beyond her comprehension. The silence between them stretched long and heavy. "The rift is not a force that can be contained or destroyed," the keeper finally said, turning his eyes back to her. "It is the binding thread between realities, created long before you or I existed. To cross it, to leave one world for another, there must be a sacrifice. The balance must be maintained." Jessica's chest tightened as the weight of his words began to settle on her. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could already feel a gnawing dread growing in the pit of her stomach, as if she already knew the answer, but couldn't bring herself to admit it. "The rift demands something from those who would pass through," the keeper said softly, his voice carrying a sadness that made her shiver. "A life, a memory, a part of your soul. You will give up something precious in order to leave this place." Jessica took an instinctual step back, her heart pounding in her chest. I can't. I can't give up something like that." The keeper's gaze softened slightly, but there was no pity in it, only understanding. "The rift does not ask for permission. It only demands what is owed." Jessica's mind raced. A life, a memory, a part of her soul. What could she give up? She couldn't bear to lose her life, her memories, or worse, her very essence. She had worked too hard to survive this far, to let it all slip away now. But the thought of being trapped here forever was almost as unbearable. "Is there another way?" she asked, her voice strained, almost pleading. "Isn't there some other option?" The keeper's face remained unreadable. The rift does not offer choices. It offers only the passage and the price. Jessica's thoughts were a blur of desperation and confusion. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't. But what could she possibly sacrifice to escape? A sudden thought struck her like lightning. Her memories. Would she be willing to lose them? The thought of forgetting everything, her family, her life, the people she loved, was too much to bear. But could she survive if she stayed here, trapped in this place forever? "Is there any other way?" she asked again, her voice trembling now. The keeper stood silently for a long moment, as though considering her question carefully. Then he spoke, his tone quiet but resolute. "The rift is not kind. It does not offer mercy." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She could see it in his eyes now, the ancient knowledge, the weight of time. The keeper knew what she was thinking. He knew she wanted to escape without paying the price. But there was no easy way out, no way to avoid the cost. "I won't make the decision for you," the keeper said, his voice low. "The choice is yours. But know this, the rift does not allow hesitation. Time is running out." With those final words, the keeper stepped back, fading into the light, leaving Jessica standing alone in the desolate, shifting landscape. The rift behind her pulsed with an almost hypnotic energy, as though beckoning her, urging her to make her decision. Jessica stood motionless for a long time, her mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. Could she really leave without paying the price? Was it possible to escape this world without giving up a part of herself? Or was that the only way forward? Her heart hammered in her chest as she considered her options, each one worse than the last. She couldn't stay here forever. But what was she willing to lose? She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing the worn photograph of her family, the only thing that had kept her grounded in this madness. The picture had been a gift from her brother, a reminder of what she was fighting for. But now, as she stared at the faded image, a realization began to settle over her. She couldn't afford to be selfish. She couldn't hold on to everything, not if it meant staying trapped here, in a world that wasn't her own. Jessica closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat as she made her choice. "I'll do it," she whispered to herself. "I'll pay the price." As soon as the words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet trembled once more, and the rift pulsed with an intense light, as though it were alive, waiting for her. The keeper's voice echoed in her mind. "The price is set. The rift is open." With a deep breath, Jessica stepped forward, walking into the light. What will Jessica lose to escape the rift? What price will she pay for her freedom? Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your thoughts matter. The light of the rift was blinding as Jessica stepped through. It wasn't like anything she had ever seen. An overwhelming cascade of colors, swirling around her in dizzying patterns. She tried to blink, but her vision was filled with 1,000 points of light, each one pulling at her, tugging her in different directions. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to maintain her balance in the chaos. Her body felt weightless, like she was floating between worlds, suspended in the void. She couldn't see where she was going, couldn't make sense of the endless array of shifting colors and distorted shapes that surrounded her. It was as though time itself had lost meaning in this place, as if she was neither moving nor standing still. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, as though she was being ripped apart and remade at the same time. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the colors faded, the light dimming to a soft glow. Jessica blinked, her vision slowly adjusting to the new surroundings. She found herself standing on solid ground once more, but it wasn't the place she had just been. It was different. A city. No, not a city. Something far older and more unsettling. The streets stretched out before her, narrow and winding, lined with towering buildings made of dark stone and metal. The architecture was unlike anything she had ever seen, ancient and futuristic all at once, as though it had been built by a civilization that understood both the past and the future in equal measure. There were no people in sight. The city was empty, its eerie silence broken only by the distant sound of wind whispering through the streets. It was as though the world had been abandoned, left to decay in the absence of life. Jessica took a cautious step forward, the crunch of her boots against the cobblestones the only sound in the stillness. Her mind raced with questions. Where was she? Had she really escaped the rift? Or was this another illusion? Another trick of the strange dimension she had passed through? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, familiar voice that sent a chill down her spine. You made it. Jessica spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Standing just behind her, silhouetted against the dim light, was the keeper. His face was shadowed, but his presence was unmistakable. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. You, Jessica gasped, her voice barely a whisper. You said I would have to pay a price. You have, the keeper interrupted, his tone quiet but final. You've already paid the price. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice rising with panic. What did I lose? The keeper didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable, as if he were studying her, gauging her reaction. Then, he spoke, his voice soft but laced with an edge of finality. You lost the only thing that mattered. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling now. She could feel the weight of his words, the significance of them pressing down on her like a physical force. What did I lose? The keeper stepped closer still, his gaze never leaving hers. The rift demands a sacrifice. A life, a memory, a piece of your soul. You can never return to what you were before. Not fully. Jessica's stomach lurched. A memory? Was that it? She had given up a memory to escape? But what memory could she have lost? She couldn't remember anything being taken from her, nothing that had seemed significant enough to warrant such a price. But then, a feeling began to creep into her consciousness, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A sense of loss, something sharp and aching, tugging at the edges of her mind. It was as if there was a gap in her memory, a place where something important should have been. She tried to grasp it, but it was elusive, slipping away every time she reached for it. The keeper's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. You don't remember yet, do you? He asked gently. The rift took more than you think. It's only a matter of time before you realize what's gone. Jessica's blood ran cold. What's gone? She whispered. What did it take from me? The keeper didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, walking slowly down the street, his robes trailing behind him like a dark shadow. You'll understand in time, he said over his shoulder. But for now, you're free. The world you left behind will move on without you. And you will move on with it, or not, as the case may be. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. What did I lose? The question echoed through her mind, but the answer remained out of reach. The keeper's words were a riddle, and she was no closer to solving it. But one thing was clear. She was not the same person who had entered the rift, and whatever price she had paid, whatever sacrifice had been made, it had changed her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. As she stood there in the empty city, the silence pressing in around her, Jessica knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. She had crossed the line, stepped into a new world, and now she had to find her place in it. What has Jessica lost? Will she ever remember the price she paid? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to follow her journey. The mystery deepens. Don't miss what happens next. Jessica's eyes scanned the silent city, her mind still reeling from the keeper's cryptic words. The absence of life in this strange place left a cold weight pressing on her chest. Everything felt wrong, as though the very air itself had been drained of warmth. Yet, there was something more troubling than the emptiness. A feeling of being watched, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that seemed to press against her skin. She shuddered, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. What did I lose? The question rattled in her mind, gnawing at her like a persistent itch. The keeper's words echoed, growing louder with each passing second, until she could hardly think of anything else. The city itself seemed to be alive, but in a way that was almost too quiet, too still. There were no sounds of life, no distant chatter or the hum of traffic. Only the soft whispers of the wind winding through the narrow alleys and over the ancient stone structures. It was as though time had frozen in place, and Jessica was the only one still moving. It was different. A city. No, not a city. Something far older and more unsettling. The streets stretched out before her, narrow and winding, lined with towering buildings made of dark stone and metal. The architecture was unlike anything she had ever seen, ancient and futuristic all at once, as though it had been built by a civilization that understood both the past and the future in equal measure. There were no people in sight. The city was empty, its eerie silence broken only by the distant sound of wind whispering through the streets. It was as though the world had been abandoned, left to decay in the absence of life. Jessica took a cautious step forward, the crunch of her boots against the cobblestones the only sound in the stillness. Her mind raced with questions. Where was she? Had she really escaped the rift? Or was this another illusion? Another trick of the strange dimension she had passed through? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, familiar voice that sent a chill down her spine. You made it. Jessica spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Standing just behind her, silhouetted against the dim light, was the keeper. His face was shadowed, but his presence was unmistakable. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. You, Jessica gasped, her voice barely a whisper. You said I would have to pay a price. You have, the keeper interrupted, his tone quiet but final. You've already paid the price. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice rising with panic. What did I lose? The keeper didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable, as if he were studying her, gauging her reaction. Then, he spoke, his voice soft but laced with an edge of finality. You lost the only thing that mattered. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling now. She could feel the weight of his words, the significance of them pressing down on her like a physical force. What did I lose? The keeper stepped closer still, his gaze never leaving hers. The rift demands a sacrifice. A life, a memory, a piece of your soul. You can never return to what you were before. Not fully. Jessica's stomach lurched. A memory? Was that it? She had given up a memory to escape? But what memory could she have lost? She couldn't remember anything being taken from her, nothing that had seemed significant enough to warrant such a price. But then, a feeling began to creep into her consciousness, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A sense of loss, something sharp and aching, tugging at the edges of her mind. It was as if there was a gap in her memory, a place where something important should have been. She tried to grasp it, but it was elusive, slipping away every time she reached for it. The keeper's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. You don't remember yet, do you? He asked gently. The rift took more than you think. It's only a matter of time before you realize what's gone. Jessica's blood ran cold. What's gone? She whispered. What did it take from me? The keeper didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, walking slowly down the street, his robes trailing behind him like a dark shadow. You'll understand in time, he said over his shoulder. But for now, you're free. The world you left behind will move on without you. And you will move on with it, or not, as the case may be. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. What did I lose? The question echoed through her mind, but the answer remained out of reach. The keeper's words were a riddle, and she was no closer to solving it. But one thing was clear. She was not the same person who had entered the rift, and whatever price she had paid, whatever sacrifice had been made, it had changed her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. As she stood there in the empty city, the silence pressing in around her, Jessica knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. She had crossed the line, stepped into a new world, and now she had to find her place in it. What has Jessica lost? Will she ever remember the price she paid? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to follow her journey. The mystery deepens. Don't miss what happens next. Jessica's eyes scanned the silent city, her mind still reeling from the keeper's cryptic words. The absence of life in this strange place left a cold weight pressing on her chest. Everything felt wrong, as though the very air itself had been drained of warmth. Yet, there was something more troubling than the emptiness. A feeling of being watched, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that seemed to press against her skin. She shuddered, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. What did I lose? The question rattled in her mind, gnawing at her like a persistent itch. The keeper's words echoed, growing louder with each passing second, until she could hardly think of anything else. The city itself seemed to be alive, but in a way that was almost too quiet, too still. There were no sounds of life, no distant chatter or the hum of traffic. Only the soft whispers of the wind winding through the narrow alleys and over the ancient stone structures. It was as though time had frozen in place, and Jessica was the only one still moving. The mystery deepens. Who is the cloaked figure, and what do they know about Jessica's past? What truth is she running from? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next shocking twist. The figure's hand hovered in the air, just inches from Jessica's face. She could feel the tension in the space between them, thick and palpable, as though the universe itself were holding its breath. Her heart raced in her chest, every nerve alight with the energy swirling around her. Something was happening, something far bigger than anything she could have imagined. The figure's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. You don't know what you've awakened, Jessica. The past is a force that cannot be controlled. Jessica's mind was spinning, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The keeper's cryptic warning was still fresh in her mind. What is this place? Who are you? She demanded, trying to steady her breathing. The figure took a step closer, the faint sound of their footfalls echoing through the courtyard. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, and the book on the pedestal pulsed with an almost sentient light. I am a custodian of forgotten things, a keeper of what was meant to be lost. And you, Jessica, are the key. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and she staggered backward, her thoughts reeling. A key? To what? To the reckoning, the figure said softly, their eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. To the truth that has been buried for centuries. The truth about who you are. About what you've forgotten. Jessica's chest tightened. The truth about what I've forgotten? The keeper had said something similar. But what truth was he talking about? Why was she the one at the center of it all? Before she could ask more, the figure raised a hand and the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently. The pillars surrounding the courtyard seemed to shift, as if the city itself were coming alive. The faint hum of ancient power grew louder, vibrating in the very air they breathed. This place, the figure continued, has been waiting for you. For the reckoning. For the return of the lost. Jessica's mind flashed to the strange symbols, the ancient carvings on the pedestal, and the overwhelming sense of familiarity she had felt when she first touched the book. There was something she had to do, something she had to understand before it was too late. Without thinking, she reached for the book again, her fingers brushing the cover, sending a shock of energy through her body. The book opened with a soft, almost reverent sound. The pages were filled with more of those strange symbols, but they began to shift and change before her eyes, the ink swirling as though alive. A voice echoed in her mind, clearer now. The past never stays buried. The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she staggered back, clutching the book to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Do you see now? The figure asked, their voice soft, almost sympathetic. The book is a map, Jessica. A map to the truth, to everything you've lost. She stared at the pages, her eyes scanning the shifting symbols. It was overwhelming, like trying to decipher an ancient language that had long been forgotten. But as she focused, something began to make sense. The symbols started to form patterns, connections that her mind could almost understand, but not quite. She felt like she was standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down into the depths of something vast and incomprehensible. What truth? She whispered, her voice trembling. What am I supposed to find? The figure smiled, though it was a grim, knowing expression. You are the key to unlocking the door, Jessica. But what lies behind it, well, that is a question only you can answer. Before she could respond, the ground shook again, more violently this time. The city seemed to groan, the stone structures creaking and cracking as if they were being pulled from their roots. The sky above them darkened, the once quiet atmosphere now heavy with an impending storm. Jessica's heart raced as she looked around, feeling the walls closing in. "What's happening?" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. The figure's face remained hidden beneath the hood, but their eyes glinted with something like pity. "The reckoning is upon us, Jessica. The past cannot remain hidden any longer. What was lost must be found, and what was forgotten must be remembered." Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps. "But I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm ready." The figure took a step forward, their voice lowering, almost a whisper. "You don't need to be ready. The truth doesn't care about readiness. It only cares about being seen." The ground beneath Jessica's feet buckled as the storm above them intensified. Lightning crackled across the sky, and the air seemed to hum with an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Jessica's thoughts were racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The world she had known was changing, unraveling, and she was at the center of it. With a sudden, impulsive decision, she slammed the book shut, cutting off the flow of energy that had been surging through her. The city seemed to sigh, as though the tension had been released, but the storm above them raged on, a wild, uncontrollable force. The figure's eyes narrowed. "You have made your choice, then?" Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never did," the figure said softly. "But that's the first step, isn't it? Admitting you don't know. Now, you must choose. What will you do with the truth when it finds you?" The figure raised a hand, and the storm above them roared in response. Lightning flashed, and Jessica was consumed by the blinding light. The storm is raging, and Jessica stands at the crossroads of destiny. What will she choose when the truth comes for her? The reckoning is only beginning. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and get ready for the next shocking twist. The storm raged, a furious maelstrom of wind and light, as Jessica stood alone in the eye of the chaos. The figure had vanished, leaving her in the epicenter of a power she couldn't begin to understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as she struggled to process the enormity of the moment. The book she held felt heavier than ever, as if it had absorbed the energy of the storm and was now pulsing with it, beating like a second heart. The light from the pages flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ancient walls surrounding her. The symbols on the pages now moving faster, shifting and rearranging themselves in an incomprehensible dance. What was that? She thought desperately. What did I just do? The air around her crackled with raw power, and the once quiet courtyard had transformed into something far more menacing. The wind howled through the broken columns, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble with anticipation. Jessica knew deep down that she had crossed some kind of threshold, one that could not be undone. Suddenly, the storm's intensity reached its peak, and the ground beneath her feet gave way. She plunged downward, the world spinning around her as the light from the book swirled in a brilliant vortex. For a moment, she felt as though she were falling into the very heart of the universe itself, caught between the past and the present, between what was and what could be. Then, with a deafening crash, everything stopped. The storm ceased. The winds died. The ground stilled. Jessica lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, her hands clutching the book to her chest. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. She could feel the presence of something. No, someone, close by, but she couldn't see anyone. It was as though the very fabric of reality had shifted, and she was standing at the threshold of a new world. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, the book still clenched tightly in her hands. She looked around, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't in the courtyard anymore. The air was heavy, thick with ancient power. The space was vast, a cavernous hall lined with towering stone pillars. The floor beneath her was covered in a mosaic of strange symbols, each one more complex than the last. It was as though the entire place had been designed to hold the weight of time itself. A low, rumbling voice broke the silence. "You have arrived." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows. From the darkness, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in shadows, their face obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" Jessica demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, they stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. The shadows seemed to part before them, as if they were being drawn to the figure's presence. "You don't remember me, do you?" the voice asked, tinged with sadness. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. "Remember?" The words hit her like a wave, and memories, long buried and forgotten, began to surface, fragments of a past she couldn't quite place. Faces, voices, places she had never visited but somehow recognized. It was as if her very soul was being flooded with memories she had no right to know. "No," she whispered, backing away. "Who are you?" The figure finally stepped into the light, and Jessica's breath hitched as she saw the face beneath the hood. It was her, but it wasn't. This person had the same features, eyes, nose, mouth, but there was something different, something older. The eyes staring back at her were filled with a deep, unshakable sorrow, as though this person had seen the end of the world and had lived to tell the tale. "It's time you understood, Jessica," the figure said, their voice softer now. "You've been searching for answers, but you've always been too afraid to ask the right questions. Now you must face the truth." Jessica took a hesitant step forward, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding before her. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The figure's expression softened, almost pitying. "You don't know who you are, do you? You've forgotten. You've been running from it your entire life." A wave of panic surged through Jessica's chest, her breath quickening. "No, I don't understand." The figure raised a hand, and the air around them shimmered. Suddenly, images began to materialize in the space before Jessica, a flood of visions, like pieces of a shattered mirror. She saw herself, no, someone who looked like her, standing in a distant past, a different time. The person was holding the same book, the same symbols flashing before her eyes. "You are not the first to bear this burden, Jessica," the figure continued, their voice heavy with regret. "Your lineage goes back far, to an age long forgotten. You are part of something much older than you can imagine. The reckoning is not just a moment in time. It is your destiny, and it has always been your destiny." Jessica's head spun, the weight of the figure's words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She tried to step back, but the images continued to swirl around her, pulling her deeper into the truth she had been running from. This cannot be real. It can't be. But it was. And she knew it. "The reckoning is coming, Jessica," the figure said, their voice growing more urgent. "And you must decide where you stand. The choices you make will determine the future of everything." Jessica stood frozen, her mind reeling. The past was no longer something she could ignore. It was something she had to face, and something she had to change. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the words, the figure raised a hand, silencing her. "You are the key," the figure said, their eyes locking onto hers. "Now choose." The past has risen, and Jessica stands at the edge of a choice that will alter the course of her future and the world. What will she decide? Don't miss the next chapter, where everything will be revealed. Subscribe, leave a comment, and stay tuned for the shocking truth. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on Jessica like a vice. The air in the cavernous hall seemed to grow heavier, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, each beat louder than the last, a frantic rhythm of fear and confusion. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go, no way to hide from the truth that had just been unveiled. The figure's gaze remained steady, unblinking, as though waiting for something, waiting for her to make the choice that would define everything. Every ounce of Jessica's being screamed for answers, but in the back of her mind, Something else whispered, a truth she couldn't yet grasp. The reckoning. The word reverberated in her mind like a drumbeat. What did it mean? And why was she the one at the center of it? You are the key, the figure repeated, their voice soft but insistent. Everything you've ever known, everything you've ever believed, it's all part of a much larger story, one that's been written long before you were born. Jessica took a step back, shaking her head, trying to push away the growing sense of terror. I'm not this person. I don't even know who you are, or what this is. I just want to know what's going on. The figure's expression softened, and they took a step closer, their movements fluid and deliberate. I understand your confusion. You were never meant to understand until now. But this moment, this choice, this is why you're here. Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts spinning like a cyclone. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of information she couldn't process, a flood of images, sounds, and emotions crashing against her. It was as though the universe itself was collapsing in on her, squeezing her into a singularity of decision. What choice? She asked, her voice trembling. What am I supposed to do? The figure extended a hand toward her, their fingers curling as if beckoning her into something vast and unknown. The choice is yours, Jessica. Will you embrace your destiny? Will you take up the mantle of those who came before you and fulfill your role in the reckoning? Or will you turn away and let the world fall into chaos? Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the weight of those words settled over her. Destiny? The reckoning? The fate of the world? How could she possibly understand such a thing? I don't know if I can, Jessica whispered, feeling the tears sting her eyes. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. The figure nodded, their expression unreadable. The path is never clear at first, but you will find your way. You always have. Jessica's mind felt like it was shattering. Memories, strange, disconnected memories, flashed before her eyes. She saw herself, years ago, as a child, sitting in a dark room, clutching the same book, her fingers tracing the same symbols. She saw faces, her family, her friends, all of them blurred and fading, like ghosts she couldn't quite reach. And then, she saw the destruction, the fire, the screams. Her breath caught in her throat. The image of a fiery sky, a world burning, filled her vision, and she could feel the heat, the unbearable weight of it. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. Is this what happens if I fail? The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they placed a hand on her shoulder, their touch surprisingly gentle. You've always had the power to change the course of things, Jessica. It has always been within you. But you must decide. You must make the choice to rise above the fear and embrace what lies ahead, or you will lose everything. Jessica's heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, like the weight of the world itself. Her hands trembled as she clutched the book tighter. The symbols on the pages shimmered, glowing with an otherworldly light. She could feel its power calling to her, urging her forward. She closed her eyes, her mind racing through the possibilities. If I choose to accept this, to accept the reckoning, what will it mean for me? For everyone I love? But if she turned away, if she walked away from this, would she be condemning the world to an irreversible darkness? Would her silence, her refusal, allow the chaos to spiral beyond repair? Tears blurred her vision as she opened her eyes, meeting the figure's steady gaze. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she whispered, her voice breaking, but I can't stand by and do nothing. I can't let everything fall apart. The figure's lips curved into a small, approving smile. You don't have to be ready, Jessica. You only have to be willing. With a trembling hand, Jessica opened the book, the light from the pages bathing her in a blinding glow. The symbols began to shift, moving faster than before, twisting and merging into a single, pulsing energy. The light surged through her, filling every corner of her being, pushing her to the edge of something powerful. And then, she knew. This was her destiny. The reckoning had begun. The choice has been made, and the reckoning is set in motion. What will Jessica's decision mean for the future? Stay tuned for the next chapter to uncover the shocking consequences of her choice. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share your thoughts. Jessica felt the surge of energy pulsating through her body, like an electric current coursing through her veins. The book in her hands burned with an intensity that she couldn't comprehend, and yet, somehow, she knew she had made the right choice. The reckoning was coming, and she had accepted her role in it. But what did that even mean? The figure before her remained silent, watching her as if studying every shift in her expression, every tremble in her form. Jessica's mind spun, her thoughts like fractured pieces of glass scattering in every direction. The world felt different, not physically, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. The ground beneath her feet hummed, as though the very earth was alive, responding to her decision. She glanced around, but the world remained unchanged, the same cavernous room stretching out before her. Nothing seemed different, but everything was different. What now? Her voice was barely above a whisper, the weight of the question pressing down on her chest. The figure stepped closer, their presence overwhelming yet strangely comforting. They didn't answer right away, instead extending a hand toward her. The gesture was inviting, but it sent a chill down Jessica's spine. "You've chosen Jessica," they finally spoke, their voice no longer a whisper but a calm, authoritative tone. "Now, you will see the truth." With a single motion, they flicked their wrist, and the space around them shifted. The room melted away, and Jessica's vision blurred, as if the very fabric of reality was bending and warping before her eyes. The air seemed to thin, and the world around her fragmented into shards of light and shadow. Time itself began to twist, stretching and folding in on itself like a torn piece of paper. "What's happening?" Jessica gasped, clutching the book tighter. Her pulse quickened as the reality around her distorted, like a dream slipping in and out of focus. She could no longer make sense of what was real and what was illusion. "You are seeing the layers of the world," the figure explained, their voice now echoing from all directions. "The layers that hide the truth that has always been there, just out of reach." The world shifted again, and this time, Jessica found herself standing in the middle of a bustling city street. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, and the sound of footsteps rushing past her. It felt real, too real, but she knew it wasn't. She was no longer in the cavern, no longer in the place where she had made her choice. The city before her was alive, vibrant, but something was wrong. The people around her walked with their heads down, their eyes vacant, as if they were unaware of the world they inhabited, as if they were all asleep. And then she saw it, a crack. It started as a small fissure in the air, barely noticeable, but it spread quickly, like a spider's web, until the entire world seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. Buildings tilted and cracked, the streets splintered, and the sky above her turned a sickly shade of red. The people around her continued to move, oblivious to the destruction unfolding around them. It was as though the world was being torn apart, and no one even noticed. "This is the truth," the figure's voice came again, now sounding distant, as though coming from a place outside of this reality. "This is what lies beneath the surface. The world you know is an illusion, a fragile construct, and you are the one who will either preserve it or destroy it." Jessica's heart raced as she took a step back, overwhelmed by the scale of what she was seeing. "I don't understand," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "How can I stop this? How can I fix it?" The figure did not answer. Instead, the vision around her shifted once more, and she found herself standing on the edge of a cliff. Below her, a vast ocean stretched out, dark and tumultuous. Waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks below, sending sprays of water into the air. And in the distance, she saw it. A massive storm, a swirling vortex of wind and lightning, growing larger with each passing second. The sky above was an unnatural shade of black, crackling with energy. The storm was coming. Jessica felt a pang of fear, a cold rush that seeped into her bones. She knew what it meant. This was the reckoning. The storm was the force that would tear the world apart, the force she was meant to stop or unleash. Her hands shook as she gripped the book tighter. The symbols on its pages had begun to glow once more, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the storm's growing intensity. The figure appeared beside her, their presence silent but unmistakable. "It is your choice, Jessica," they said. "You have the power to stop it, but it will cost you. The price of saving the world is not without sacrifice." Jessica's mind reeled. How could she possibly comprehend such a choice? What was she willing to sacrifice to save everyone she loved, to stop this storm from consuming everything? She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the swirling chaos around her only grew louder, more overwhelming. "What if I can't do it? What if I fail?" "Don't doubt yourself," the figure said, as though reading her thoughts. "The reckoning has already begun. It is already in motion. You must choose whether to embrace it or to stop it." Jessica opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the storm in the distance. The weight of the choice pressed down on her, suffocating her with its enormity. She could feel the world teetering on the edge, ready to fall apart, and she was the only one who could decide its fate. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was here. Jessica could feel its pulse in the air, a palpable pressure that pressed against her skin, vibrating with an energy she couldn't quite understand. The crackling of the storm mingled with the sounds of the city unraveling around her, the streets now filled with echoes of destruction as the illusion that held everything together began to collapse. Jessica's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest, the ancient symbols on its pages glowing brighter than ever. The power was within her, but she had no idea how to wield it. The weight of the decision crushed down on her, a crushing reminder of how much was at stake. Behind her, the figure stood in silence, watching her every move, every flicker of doubt that passed over her face. Their expression was unreadable, yet Jessica knew they were waiting for her to act, to choose. "You have to act now," the figure's voice broke the silence, its calm tone betraying the urgency of the situation. "The storm is already here. If you do nothing, everything will be consumed. But if you choose to fight it..." Jessica turned to face the figure, her heart pounding in her chest. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered, the fear raw in her voice. "What if I can't stop it?" The figure's gaze softened, though there was no trace of pity. "Strength is not measured by your ability to control the storm, Jessica. It's measured by your will to face it. The reckoning is not about power, it's about choice. And the price of that choice is yours to pay." The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't provide the clarity she so desperately needed. Jessica felt a cold sweat forming on her brow as the storm raged around her. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. "Make your choice," the figure urged. "The world is waiting." Jessica looked back at the storm, her heart racing as she saw the destruction unfolding before her. The sky had turned a terrifying shade of black, swirling with dark clouds that twisted into a vortex of lightning and thunder. The earth beneath her feet trembled, as though the very ground was preparing to give way. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, but the image of the storm, the power, the destruction, the chaos, was too overwhelming. The reckoning was here, and she had been thrust into the heart of it. "I can't just stand here and do nothing." Her fingers brushed the pages of the book, feeling the warmth of its power, the energy coursing through her fingertips. She could feel the choices within the symbols, the path that led either to salvation or ruin. The reckoning wasn't just about the storm. It was about everything, everyone, all of it woven together in a web of fate. Jessica opened her eyes, her mind made up. "I will fight it. I have to fight." The book flared to life in her hands, the ancient symbols blazing with an intensity that sent a shock of energy through her body. She felt the power surge within her, filling every part of her being, overwhelming her senses. The storm raged in front of her, its fury unchecked, but now, for the first time, Jessica felt as though she had the strength to stand against it. Without thinking, she stepped forward, the ground beneath her cracking as she moved. The storm roared louder, its winds howling as they tore through the air, but Jessica stood her ground, her eyes locked on the heart of the tempest. She raised the book high, the pages shimmering with light, and then, nothing. The silence was deafening. Jessica froze, panic creeping up her spine. Had she done something wrong? Was it too late? Suddenly, the air around her vibrated with an unnatural hum, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble once more. The storm surged forward, its fury aimed directly at her. She could feel the energy, the raw power of it, crashing against her like an unstoppable wave. But then, something strange happened. The storm seemed to hesitate, its ferocity wavering for just a moment. The air around Jessica shimmered, rippling like heat off pavement. A voice, an echo of her own, whispered in her mind. The storm is not just an enemy. It is a test. A test? Jessica muttered, her voice shaky but determined. What do you mean? The figure stepped closer, their form flickering in and out of focus. The storm is a reflection of your own inner chaos. The reckoning is not simply the destruction of the world. It is the destruction of all you have ever known, of everything you believe to be true. Jessica's heart clenched. Then what am I supposed to do? She demanded. How can I stop this? The figure's eyes gleamed with a quiet understanding. By facing the truth. Jessica's breath hitched as she looked back at the storm. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what the figure meant. The truth. What truth? The truth of what? She whispered, but the figure's answer came not in words, but in a flash of understanding that exploded inside her mind. The storm wasn't just a force of nature. It wasn't simply destruction. It was the culmination of all the fear, all the hatred, all the division she had fought so hard to ignore. It was the reckoning, yes, but it was also the reflection of her own fears, her own uncertainties. And if she was to stop it, she had to face it, head on. The figure stepped back, their face fading into the shadows. The storm will test you, Jessica. Your choice will shape everything that comes after. Jessica took a deep breath, summoning all the courage she had left. This was it, the moment of truth. The reckoning wasn't just about saving the world. It was about saving herself. With a cry of determination, she raised the book once more, and the storm roared in response, the sky crackling with energy. It was time. The storm is growing stronger, and Jessica is about to face the truth of her power. Will she be able to stop it before it consumes everything? The reckoning is far from over. Don't miss what happens next. Comment, share, and subscribe to stay on the edge of your seat. The air crackled with energy, charged with the raw force of the storm as Jessica stood, the book gripped tightly in her hands. She could feel it now, the truth, burning inside her chest, awakening something deep within. It was as if the storm had become a living entity, watching, waiting, as it circled around her, its winds howling with impatience. Jessica could feel the truth in every corner of her being. The storm was not just an external force. It was a reflection of the chaos within herself, within the world. She had spent so long running from it, trying to suppress the darkness that lived in her heart, but now there was no choice. She had to face it, or be consumed by it. As the storm roared louder, Jessica's pulse quickened. She closed her eyes, focusing on the power coursing through her, the ancient energy of the book that had become a part of her. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, each heartbeat echoing in her ears, the storm's fury a constant reminder of what was at stake. This is it, she thought, her mind racing. This is my moment. I can either let the storm destroy everything, or I can end it once and for all. Her grip tightened on the book, and the symbols on the pages began to glow brighter, their energy pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She could feel the storm pushing against her, testing her resolve. The wind screamed in her ears, the sky flashing with lightning as if the very heavens were trying to tear her apart. But she refused to back down. The figure appeared again, standing just outside the storm's reach, watching her with an unreadable expression. Jessica could feel their presence, their power, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, there was no judgment, no pressure, just silence. Jessica, the figure said softly, their voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The truth is not something you can escape. It is a part of you, as much as it is a part of the world. And only by facing it, by accepting it, will you have the power to stop what is coming. Jessica's throat tightened as the words sunk in. She wanted to fight it. to reject it. But the truth was already inside her, woven into the very fabric of her being. She had seen it in the faces of those she loved, in the choices she had made, in the lies she had told herself to keep moving forward. The reckoning is not just the storm, she realized. It is everything. It is me. The realization hit her like a wave, a flood of memories and emotions crashing over her all at once. The choices she had made, the paths she had taken, the things she had allowed to fester within her. The anger, the resentment, the fear. It had all been building up, feeding into the storm, and now it was here, demanding to be faced. Her chest tightened as the weight of it all threatened to suffocate her. But in that moment, something shifted. The storm, for all its power, began to slow, its ferocity waning, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Jessica took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She couldn't run anymore. The storm, the reckoning, it wasn't just something outside of her. It was a part of her. And if she wanted to stop it, she had to face it, head on. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her eyes, her gaze locked onto the storm. The wind howled, but it wasn't as loud as before. The storm seemed to pause, as though it too were waiting for her. "I accept it," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I accept the truth. All of it." The moment she spoke, the storm exploded in a burst of light, the energy surging outward, crashing against the ground, splitting the sky wide open. The air grew thick with power, but Jessica stood firm, her arms outstretched, the book glowing brighter than ever. The world around her began to shift, the ground beneath her feet trembling as if reality itself were bending in response to her words. The storm raged, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was a part of her, a force she could harness, control. She could feel it in the air, in the very core of her being. The reckoning was not an external force. It was the culmination of everything she had ever experienced, everything she had ever been. "I am the storm," she thought, the realization grounding her in a way she had never felt before. "And I am the one who can end it." With a powerful cry, she slammed the book down onto the ground, the pages glowing with a brilliant light that pierced through the storm's fury. The energy surged outward, crashing into the heart of the tempest. The world seemed to hold its breath as the storm paused, suspended in time. The winds stopped, the lightning ceased, and the sky cleared. For the briefest of moments, there was complete silence. And then, it happened. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, a wave of power that spread out across the world, calming the storm. The winds died down, the thunder faded, and the dark clouds began to dissipate. The air grew still, almost peaceful, as the chaos that had reigned for so long was finally brought to an end. Jessica collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged, her body exhausted. The book in her hands had lost its glow, its power now spent. She looked around, the world quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. The storm was gone. The reckoning was over. But as she sat there, trembling, she knew that this was only the beginning. The truth had been unleashed, and the world had changed. There was no going back. The choices she had made would echo through the future, shaping everything that came after. And as the last remnants of the storm faded into the horizon, Jessica realized that the real reckoning had only just begun. The storm has been quelled, but the true consequences of Jessica's choices are just starting to unfold. What will happen next? Can the world truly heal from the chaos? Don't miss the next chapter. Comment, share, and subscribe to stay with Jessica as she faces the aftermath of the reckoning. The world was eerily still. The storm, once a raging beast that clawed at the edges of the earth, had receded, leaving behind an unnatural silence. Jessica remained kneeling in the center of the empty field, her body aching from the intense surge of power she had just released. Her chest heaved with each breath, the weight of the decision she had made pressing down on her like a physical force. The book lay beside her, now closed and still, as though it had given all it had to give. There was no more glowing, no more energy pulsing from its pages. It was just a book again. But it was not the same book that had called her into this reckoning. It was not the same world either. She rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and looked around. What had been a storm, an uncontrollable wild force, was now a calm, empty space. The clouds, once dark and full of rage, had disappeared, leaving behind only a pale, quiet sky. There was no more thunder, no more lightning, just the crisp air and the lingering feeling that something monumental had shifted. Jessica felt the presence of the figure again, standing at the edge of the field, watching her. Their face was obscured, their features hidden beneath a shadow. But there was no fear this time. She wasn't afraid anymore. "You did it," the figure said, their voice soft but carrying the weight of the universe. "The storm has ended. The reckoning has passed. But what comes next, Jessica? That is where your true challenge begins." Her heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped forward, their silhouette sharp against the brightening sky. "The storm was only the beginning. You have released something far greater than you can yet understand. The world will never be the same, and neither will you." Jessica's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the gravity of their words sinking in, like stones dropped into a deep well. She had quelled the storm, but what came after? The reckoning was over, but it had left a trail of destruction in its wake. Could anything ever truly return to normal? "I don't know if I can handle this," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I've seen too much, felt too much. This power, it's too much for me." The figure nodded, as if expecting her answer. "The truth is never easy to bear. But now, you must face the hardest part. You must find a way to live with it, to rebuild what was broken, to mend the wounds that have been left behind." Jessica looked down at the book, her gaze lingering on its worn cover. The truth it had revealed to her. Everything she had known about the world, about herself, had been turned upside down. The storm had been a reflection of the chaos within, but now the world itself was a mirror of that chaos. The people she had once known, the relationships she had once trusted, were all tainted by the knowledge of what had truly been happening beneath the surface. The weight of that knowledge was suffocating. She could feel the remnants of the storm still swirling around her, just beneath the surface, as if waiting for her to make her next move. "You're not alone," the figure said, their voice carrying a sense of quiet reassurance. "There are others, scattered across the world, who have been touched by this storm. Some will help you. Some will try to stop you. But the choice will always be yours. You are the one who must decide how the world moves forward." Jessica's mind raced. She had no idea what to do next. The storm had brought clarity, but it had also torn apart the fabric of everything she knew. There were too many forces at play, too many unanswered questions. How could she possibly rebuild when everything felt so broken? But one thing was certain. She couldn't just sit back and wait for things to happen. She had to act. She had to rebuild. And for the first time since the reckoning had begun, Jessica felt the stirring of something inside her, a resolve. She didn't know how to fix the world, but she knew she couldn't let it stay in pieces. Not when there was a chance, no matter how small, to make it whole again. "I'll try," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'll try to make it right." The figure nodded, their presence beginning to fade, their form dissolving into the air like smoke. "That is all anyone can ask of you," they said. "But remember, Jessica, what you have done cannot be undone. The truth has been set free. Now you must live with it and decide how it will shape you." As the figure disappeared, the world around Jessica began to shift again. The field she stood in was no longer empty. Shadows had crept in, whispers of the past, remnants of the storm's rage, still lingering in the air. She could feel them watching her, waiting for her next move. There was no going back. The storm had changed everything. The world had changed, but so had she. And as she took her first step forward, Jessica knew that the path ahead would be one of both destruction and creation. She had been given the power to shape the world, but it was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Jessica has made her choice, but the true consequences of her actions are only just beginning to unfold. What will she do next? How will she navigate the chaos she has unleashed? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Comment, share, and subscribe to follow Jessica's journey as she attempts to rebuild a broken world. The air was crisp as Jessica walked through the remnants of the field, the path ahead uncertain but determined. She had no idea what she would find, who she would encounter, or how long it would take to rebuild what had been torn apart by the storm. But she had a singular purpose now: to live with the truth, to face the consequences of her actions, and to rebuild what she had lost. As she walked, the landscape around her seemed to shift and change, the world itself holding its breath as though it too was unsure of what was to come. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been altered. Every step she took left an imprint on the ground, a ripple in the universe. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the power she had unlocked during the storm, like an endless well of energy, waiting to be used. But she didn't know how to harness it yet. For the first time, she realized how much had been left in the wake of the reckoning. The fractured relationships, the broken promises, the memories that now felt like distant echoes. What had been real before the storm no longer felt solid. The people she had known, the places she had visited, everything was blurred, changed, as if reality itself was uncertain of where it stood. And it wasn't just the world outside of her that had changed. She, too, had transformed. The girl who had once hesitated, who had been unsure of her place in the world, was gone. In her place stood someone who had seen the deepest corners of the world's darkness, someone who had unlocked secrets that could never be undone. Jessica knew, without a doubt, that she would never be the same again. She didn't know where to begin. The task of rebuilding seemed insurmountable. Would she be able to help the people who had suffered because of the storm? Would she be able to heal the broken parts of herself? A voice broke through her thoughts. "You're not alone, Jessica." She turned, startled by the sudden sound. There, standing before her, was a figure she recognized. Samuel, his face marked by the storm's remnants, his eyes shadowed with the weight of all they had endured. He was alive. He had made it through, just as she had. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. How did you?" "I survived," he said simply, stepping closer. "And I knew you would, too. We both have something we need to do. We have a world to rebuild." Jessica took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. There was no time to waste. They couldn't undo what had been done, but they could make something new. Together, they could find a way forward. "How do we even begin?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. "We start with what we know," Samuel replied. "We start with the people. We find the others, the ones who were touched by the storm. They're out there. Some will want to destroy what's left, others will want to fix it, and some will just want to survive." Jessica nodded, the clarity of his words grounding her. The world had been broken, but it wasn't beyond saving. There were others who had felt the storm's effects, just as she had. Together, they would figure out how to make it whole again. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but it was possible. It had to be. As they began walking toward the horizon, the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the barren field. The storm was over. The reckoning had passed. And now, in the quiet aftermath, there was space for something new to grow. But there was still so much unknown. The world had changed, and with it, the people within it. Jessica and Samuel would have to find a way to bring people together, to face what had been unleashed, and to rebuild what had been lost. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about finding hope in the wreckage. "There's more to be done," Samuel said, his voice firm. "But for now, we walk forward. Together." And so they did. Step by step, each one moving through the shattered remains of the world, determined to find a way to build something new from the ruins of the old. The reckoning has ended, but the journey is just beginning. Jessica and Samuel are ready to rebuild, but the road ahead is filled with danger and uncertainty. What will they find as they search for the others? Will they succeed in rebuilding, or will the forces they unleash tear them apart? Share your thoughts, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter of their journey.